In a town where perfection was tradition and silence was survival, one family's legacy buried more than secrets. It buried a child. What if everything your hometown celebrated was built on what it refused to see? Stay with me, because the truth isn't in the mansion. It's in the backyard. Returning to Langridge was like stepping into a photograph that had yellowed at the edges, its gloss dull by time, but the smile still frozen, still perfect, still lying. Because every brick, every fence, every well-manicured lawn whispered truth I hadn't dared to hear as a child. Now, older and weathered, I heard it in the silence between polite greetings and the hollow echo of my own footsteps down Sycamore Lane, where I had once ridden my bike without fear, where every window had eyes and every porch held stories spoken only in guarded tones once the sun went down. Yet still I came back, not because I missed the town, but because I couldn't stop the dreams, the ones that pressed against my ribs with the weight of a name I had tried to forget. Langridge, the family that loomed over the town like a monument and a mausoleum in one, revered like saints by the Chamber of Commerce, eulogized while still alive by the school district, and spoken of by everyone else with that soft reverence people reserve for things too close to worship and too far from truth. And as I drove past the old bakery, the scent of cinnamon and something else, chemical, sterile, brought back flashes of a day I couldn't place, a voice I couldn't name, and a promise made under the shadow of their backyard tree, a promise I had broken or maybe never fully understood. Because Langridge wasn't just a family here. They were the heartbeat, the ribbon at the county fair, the anonymous donation at Christmas, the private handshakes behind public doors. And as I stood on the curb outside their estate, now overgrown, the gate rusted slightly at the hinges, the mailbox listing to one side like a tired sentinel, I realized that what I had come back for wasn't closure but confession, not mine but theirs, or maybe the town's, or maybe everyone's, because everyone in Langridge had something they'd chosen not to remember, and what terrified me most was that I had lived next door to them for 12 years, shared dinners, barbecues, lemonade stands with their children, and still, I couldn't remember the name of their youngest son. Or was it a daughter? Only that there had been one more than we ever spoke of, someone who had been there, and then not, like a chalk drawing washed away by sudden rain. And no one had talked about it, not the neighbors, not the school, not even my own parents, who shut down entirely when I once asked why the back gate of the Langridge property was padlocked on the inside. And now that I stood here again, older, tired, with my marriage barely breathing and my mother gone and the past creeping like fog under the door, I needed to know why I remembered laughter behind that fence, but never saw who it belonged to, why the Langridges held barbecues every summer, but always closed the blinds on the back half of the house, why the attic light had flickered even during blackouts, and why, most of all, no one else seemed to care. Not then, not now. Even when the youngest Langridge child stopped coming to school, when their desk sat empty for 3 weeks before it disappeared entirely, and the teacher never mentioned it, as though the absence were a shadow mistaken for a stain, and the town just moved on, as it always did, as though people could evaporate like morning dew without raising a single alarm. And maybe they could, because this was a town where legacy meant silence, and silence meant safety, and the Langridge name covered a multitude of sins. Sins I could no longer ignore, not after the letter I found in my mother's drawer after her death, the one sealed with wax and addressed to no one, written in her trembling hand, with just one line: "Don't dig up what they buried in the yard," which should have been metaphor, poetic, the scribbles of a woman slipping away from lucidity. But when I held that paper, I remembered a summer day when I was 9, when the sprinklers turned red, and my father yelled for me to go inside. And the Langridge children stood perfectly still, their clothes soaked, their mouths shut, as if they were dolls set for display. And I never asked what had happened, because no one ever asked anything here. Not when the Langridge father vanished for a month and came back thinner, colder. Not when their dog disappeared and a new one showed up, same breed, same name, but with eyes that didn't match. And now, decades later, I realized that the Langridge estate wasn't abandoned. It was just waiting, holding its breath, as though it knew I'd return, as though it had something left to show me, something I had missed when I was too young to question the rules, too trusting to see the cracks beneath the foundation. And as I pushed the rusted gate open with a screech that echoed down the street like a scream strangled at birth, I felt the ground beneath my feet shift, not literally, but in the way memories do when you finally let them breathe, because I knew, without doubt, that whatever lay in That backyard, whatever truth had been hidden behind trimmed hedges and practiced smiles, was tied to me, not just as a witness, but as someone who had participated, unknowingly or not, and whatever the Langridge legacy was, it wasn't just theirs. It was the town's, and by extension, mine, and I wasn't leaving until I unearthed it all, even if it meant discovering that I, too, had worn a mask my whole life, one stitch from denial, silence, an illusion of childhood innocence. The morning, after I stepped onto the Langridge property, the sky broke into a dull, gray overcast, casting a sickly pallor over the town as if even the weather knew not to show too much light here, and I found myself walking the streets of my childhood with the slow, uncertain steps of someone returning to a place that only pretended to remember them. Familiar faces glanced up and then away, smiling out of habit rather than recognition, and as I wandered deeper into the heart of Langridge, the framed pictures that lined the walls of the town hall, the school lobby, and even the dusty corners of the diner revealed the curated memory this town had chosen to preserve, the Langridge family frozen in time. Crisp suits, pastel dresses, arms interlocked, smiles symmetrical and utterly void of warmth, the kind of perfection that didn't breathe, didn't move, and certainly didn't feel, and as I stood before those portraits, my eyes lingered on the second son, Thomas, blond, blue-eyed, always posed, just slightly apart from the others, and I remembered his nervous laugh and how he'd always glance over his shoulder when we were alone, as if someone might be listening even in the middle of the woods behind our houses. But what struck me more was who was in the pictures. There had been a third child, hadn't there? Younger than Thomas, quieter than Margaret, their sister, and as I questioned the gap in the photographs, it became clear that this town, in all its obsessive documentation, had edited its history like a yearbook photo retouched until no blemish remained. And when I asked at the library if they had any older town directories or school records, the librarian, a soft-spoken woman with tired eyes who used to give me lemon drops from the desk jar, stiffened almost imperceptibly and told me the archives were under reorganization, a process that apparently had taken years, and that if I was looking for something specific, I should try the Historical Society, which was housed, rather ironically, in the Langridge Cultural Center, a sleek, glass-paneled building donated by the family in 1998, a fact proudly displayed on a bronze plaque at the entrance, beneath which I paused, wondering how deeply a legacy could be etched into stone before it became a weight instead of a tribute. And inside, I found more of the same, display cases filled with trophies, awards, campaign photos. Did I remember Mr. Langridge running for mayor? And a looping video of testimonials about the family's immeasurable contribution to civic life. A phrase that played in my mind like a needle skipping on an old record. And in that moment, I felt something crack. Not loudly, not visibly, but internally, as though the foundation of my own childhood memories had just shifted a fraction of an inch, enough to make everything feel off kilter. And it wasn't until I spoke with Elaine, one of my few remaining friends in town, that I realized just how far the fractures ran. Because when I brought up the Langridge estate and my interest in their family history, she blinked once, twice, and then offered a smile so careful it might have been carved from glass, telling me gently, some stories aren't ours to remember, before quickly changing the subject to her daughter's piano lessons. But I couldn't let it go. Not anymore. And that night, sitting alone in my motel room with its peeling wallpaper and the buzz of the ancient mini-fridge, I dug out the old yearbooks I kept out of nostalgia or maybe guilt, flipping through page after page until I reached the year I was in 5th grade, the year I knew something had happened, something we all felt but never named, and there, wedged between the group photo of the class trip and the candid shots from recess, was a face I hadn't seen in years, a boy named Caleb, smaller than the others, dark-haired, with a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes, and as I stared at that photo, my stomach twisted because I did remember him, not from parties or class, but from the window of the Langridge's back room, where I'd sometimes catch a fleeting glimpse of someone watching from behind the curtain, someone who never came out, never played, never spoke, and yet his presence had lingered like the scent of something scorched in the air long after the fire was gone, and when I turned the page, he was gone. No more photos, no mention in the notes, and by 6th grade, he was erased completely, his name absent from the class list, as if he'd never existed, and I realized with a slow, creeping horror that the town hadn't forgotten him. They'd chosen to forget, to cut out the imperfection like a surgeon excising a tumor, but memory doesn't work that way, not truly, And now that the image was back in my mind, I couldn't stop seeing it. Caleb standing, alone in the Langridge backyard, near the edge of the fence, eyes fixed on something I couldn't see, shoulders hunched not in fear, but in resignation, as if he had already accepted whatever fate had been assigned to him, and I couldn't help but feel deep in my bones that I had seen something back then, something I'd suppressed out of fear or loyalty, or the numbing effect of growing up in a place where truth was always wrapped in ribbons and buried under marble. And so I drove back to the estate the next morning, this time with camera and notebook, telling myself it was for closure, for understanding, but knowing full well that I had already begun to dig, not with a shovel, but with memory, and what I would find might not be what I wanted, but what I needed. And as I approached the back of the house, past the collapsed greenhouse and the rusted swing set, I saw it, etched faintly into the wooden slats of the old garden bench. Seal 1994, and below it, in fainter, more. Desperate scratches, still here, and the air around me thickened, not with dread, but with a heavy pressure truth pushing up from the soil, waiting for someone, anyone, to finally notice. The cellar door remained shut beneath its mat of moss and decades of intentional forgetting, but once seen, it could no longer be unseen, and as I stood there with my hand trembling near the rusted latch, I realized that opening it wouldn't just uncover whatever the Langridges had hidden, it would force the town confront what it had chosen to ignore, and I wasn't ready for that. Not yet, not without understanding the full weight of what I was about to exhume. So I stepped back, breath unsteady, and walked the perimeter of the estate again, this time with sharper eyes and a heart that no longer beat out nostalgia, but of something closer to mourning, because it became clear to me then that the Langridges weren't a family in the way most people think of families. They were an image, a carefully controlled brand, a collective silence held together by discipline and fear and the thin varnish of social grace. And as I sat on a rotting swing set and watched the sun bleed through the trees, I found myself trying to piece together what I remembered of each of them. Mr. Langridge, tall and precise, with a voice like a sermon and hands that never looked callous no matter how many barbecues he hosted. Mrs. Langridge, always in pastels, her expressions perfectly pitched to every occasion, her kindness delivered in doses too exact to feel real, like medication measured by the milliliter. Margaret, their eldest, whose eyes always seemed older than the rest of her face, who once told me during a game of hide and seek that she didn't play to win, she played to disappear. And Thomas, who laughed too loudly at his father's jokes and flinched every time someone said his name too sharply. And then there was Caleb, the ghost in the family portrait, the boy who existed in fragments of memory in silent places, who wasn't just forgotten, he was erased. And I knew then that this wasn't just about a missing child. It was about what a family had to become in order to lose someone and keep smiling through church, through PTA meetings, through scholarship ceremonies and town hall dedications. And so I left the estate again, this time to find someone who might still have the pieces I lacked, and that search led me to the assisted living home at the edge of town, where Margaret now lived under a different last name, married once, divorced, no children, and barely 55, though she looked older, her face drawn not by time but by something far heavier. And when I visited her, she didn't flinch at the sight of me, didn't pretend not to remember, just nodded slowly and said, "I wonder when you'd come," as if all of this had been written already. And we sat in the courtyard under a dying elm, her tea untouched, my questions forming carefully in my throat, because I didn't want to frighten her away, not yet. And when I asked about Caleb, she didn't answer directly, not at first, but instead told me a story about a family vacation to Lake Haven, how she and Thomas spent the whole week trying to build a raft while their parents fought every night behind thin cabin walls. And I almost missed it when she said Caleb stayed in the room most of the time, because there was confirmation, and I leaned in gently, asking what kind of child he was, and she blinked at me slowly and said, "Quiet, too quiet. He didn't know how to be invisible the way the rest of us did." And then she looked away, and I saw the tears she didn't wipe, didn't acknowledge, and I realized that she had carried this weight her entire life. The guilt of knowing and not saving him, the agony of surviving a house that ate one of its own, and when I asked her directly what happened to him, her hands trembled and she whispered, he wanted love too openly. He didn't understand that love wasn't safe in our house. And I felt those words hit me like cold water, because it wasn't abuse in the traditional sense, not just beatings or yelling. It was the absence of warmth, the systematic breaking of spirit in the name of discipline, obedience, and control, and she told me about the way their father kept a ledger of mistakes, tallied in red pen, how their mother measured affection in quotas. Smiles only if grades were perfect, hugs only if teeth were, brushes shine, and Caleb, being the youngest, the softest, had always needed more than they were allowed to give. And one night, Margaret said he tried to run away, not with a bag, not far, just into the wood behind the house. And they found him hours later, shivering, crying, and the next morning he was gone. And when she asked her mother, the response was a sip of coffee and the words, "Don't ask again." And they didn't, none of them did, because the house ran on fear disguised as propriety, and the town enabled it, rewarded it, because to question the Langridges was to question the very image Langridge had of itself, and no one was willing to look in that mirror too long. And as I sat there, listening to her voice crack under the weight of decades, I knew that Margaret had been a prisoner just as much as Caleb, that silence had been her only means of survival, and I promised her, not for closure, not for vengeance, but for truth, that I would find out what really happened. And she looked at me with a kind of fragile hope, the kind that hurts to carry, and said, "If you go into the cellar, don't go alone." And though I didn't ask why, I understood the warning. It wasn't superstition, it was memory, raw and bloodied, buried under lock and latch. And as I drove back toward the estate, the sky now bruising toward dusk, I began to prepare myself for what lay ahead, because the Langridge legacy wasn't just dominance. It was silence sculpted into a monument, and I was about to chip away at its foundation. The sun had just dropped below the tree line when I returned to Langridge estate, and though the sky still held a fading gold at its edges, the house and yard had already sunk into shadow, and I stood once more before the half-buried metal door, my breath a steady rhythm in the gathering stillness. And this time I didn't hesitate, didn't let fear or memory or the echo of Margaret's voice slow me down, because the truth was close now, close enough to feel. In the way the air thickened as I pried at the rusted latch, each movement stiff with age and dread, and when the lock gave way with a dry snap, the smell that escaped was not rot, not death, but mildew and dust and something else. Something chemical, like old bleach or faded ammonia, and I pulled a hatch open to reveal a narrow set of wooden stairs descending into darkness. And though my flashlight flickered like it didn't want to be there, I stepped down slowly, my heart climbing into my throat with every creak beneath my feet. And as the last bit of light from above faded behind me, I reached the cellar floor, the flashlight's beam catching cobwebs, rusted pipes, and walls lined with what first appeared to be discarded furniture covered in sheets. But as I peeled them back one by one, I realized I wasn't looking at furniture. I was looking at cages, small, square, reinforced with thick mesh and latches, and some still-held objects inside, broken toys, chewed pencils, blankets, with names stitched into the fabric, Thomas, Margaret, and one in the far corner marked only with faded CL in blue thread. And the sight of it sent a cold spike through my spine, because this wasn't a storm cellar. It was a place designed to confine, to isolate, and the questions that haunted me for days now screamed their answers in stillness. Caleb hadn't disappeared. He'd been hidden, locked away not for punishment but for control, and suddenly Margaret's voice came rushing back. He wanted love too openly, and it clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Caleb had been too soft, too emotional, too disobedient to the family image, and rather than risk the stain of public imperfection, the Langridges had tucked it beneath their backyard like a secret they could afford to forget, and I staggered back, bile rising in my throat, unable to comprehend the scale of it. Not just the cruelty, but the precision, the absolute intent behind it all, and in a plastic bin beside the cage, I found burned photo negatives, scorched and warped, but still bearing fragments of faces, one of which was unmistakably Caleb's, older than the yearbook photo, maybe 10 or 11, sitting on the porch steps with a book in his lap and a bruise on his temple, and I dropped the photo as if it burned, because I realized then that he hadn't died when he vanished. He'd lived for a time, perhaps even years, in this underground prison, while the town smiled and clapped at Langridge, fundraisers and scholarship galas. And what made it worse was that someone had helped. Someone had known. Walter, yes, but more than that, maybe teachers, maybe neighbors, maybe my own parents. Because how else could something this monstrous go unchallenged? And as I stumbled further into the cellar, I found a second room, smaller, darker, and lined with shelves that held notebooks, each marked with dates and initials. And as I flipped through one, the entries chilled me to the marrow. They were logs written in meticulous, emotionless script. Refused dinner. 9 p.m. screamed when light was turned off. Applied sedative. Confined again. And it was signed, ML again and again, over months, maybe years, and I knew then that Mrs. Langridge had been not only complicit, but the architect of this hidden world. And I remember her pastel dresses and serene smiles, and wonder how many times I'd sat across from her as she poured me lemonade with the same hands that drugged her son to sleep in a cage, and the full weight of what the Langridge legacy meant settled on me with a force that left me breathless, because this wasn't just about a boy who'd been forgotten. It was about a town that had chosen, willfully, to protect a myth rather than a child. And as I turned to leave, flashlight shaking in my hand, I caught sight of a sealed envelope tacked to the back wall, brittle with age, addressed simply, "To the one who remembers," and with shaking fingers I opened it, revealing a letter written in a child's scrawl, Caleb's. I knew it instantly, short, heartbreakingly simple. If you're reading this, I guess I didn't make it, but I hope you did. I hope you remember me. I hope someone does. And those words carved themselves into my bones, because that was the truth, the twist, not a plot, but heart. Caleb didn't just die. He was erased, first by his family, then by his town, and finally by time. And all he had ever asked, all he had ever wanted, was to be remembered. And as I emerged into night, the stars harsh and indifferent above, I knew that nothing about Langridge could ever be seen the same way again. Not the name, not the family, not the manicured yards or smiling portraits, because beneath every perfect lawn and polished plaque lay the story of a boy buried alive by silence. The night after I left the cellar, I didn't sleep, not because of fear in traditional sense, but because everything in me felt peeled open, raw, and exposed, and when I closed my eyes, I didn't see monsters or darkness. I saw Caleb crouched behind those bars, his face slack with exhaustion and resignation, and I saw myself, years younger, laughing just a few yards. Above him on the swing set while he sat beneath the earth like a buried truth, and that realization that I had played, eaten, even napped in a home that sat directly above a child being systemically broken, sent waves of nausea rolling through me. And in that hour between midnight and morning, I understood what people mean when they say a house can carry memory, not in the poetic sense, but in the way it holds heat, absorbs voices, echoes choices made in whispers and screams alike. And that Langridge house, now silent, now hollow, had never truly slept. It had absorbed everything, sealed it behind walls and under floors, let its white shutters and wide verandas mask the fact that behind them lived cruelty so cold, so careful. It didn't even need to raise its voice, and I thought about Margaret, her face hollowed by years of pretending not to know what she had always known, and Thomas, whose laughter I now heard differently, forced, manic, the sound of someone trying not to be next. And I realized that survival in that house hadn't been about escape. It had been about obedience, about learning to mimic the emotional vacancy their parents mistook for strength. And I saw how even the town had learned that lesson. How to nod, smile, and never look too closely. How to accept the sudden absence of a child as easily as a change in weather. And the more I thought about it, the more I remembered moments from my own childhood that now rang with sinister clarity. Like the time I wandered too far behind the Langridge shed, and Mr. Langridge's tone shifted so suddenly, so forcefully, it made me cry, only for him to pat my shoulder seconds later and call it just firm love. Or the afternoon my mother told me not to ask questions about why the Langridge kids never had sleepovers, saying simply, "They're a different kind of family." And now I knew that what she meant wasn't difference. It was danger and worse. She'd known it and said nothing, and when I called her old. Friend Mrs. Harris, the former school nurse, under the pretense of asking about old student health files, her voice caught slightly when I mentioned Caleb, then steadied unnaturally fast, and she said, "There's no file under that name." And when I pushed, asking how that was possible for a child who'd attended for years, she paused too long, then replied, "You must be mistaken," and hung up, and I stared at my phone for a long time, realizing that even decades later, people still clung to the lie, because the truth would mean admitting they looked the other way. And so I turned to someone who hadn't, Walter, the caretaker, the man who had stood by silently but never left, and I found him again near the guest house, seated on a cracked plastic chair like he'd never moved. And I told him everything I had seen, everything I now knew, and to my surprise, he didn't look shocked, just tired, infinitely tired And when I asked why he never said anything, he looked at me with such sorrow. It nearly undid me, and he said, "Because no one would have listened. Not then, not to someone like me." And I understood what he meant, understood the layers of power and race and class that had silenced his warnings before he even spoke them. And when I asked if Caleb had ever gotten out, if there had ever been a chance, he shook his head slowly and said, "I think." He stopped trying, and that answer stayed with me, haunted me more than the cages or the logs or the absence of a body, because it spoke of something deeper than cruelty. It spoke of erasure so complete, so unrelenting, that even hope had been extracted like a rot, and now, armed with truth, I found myself unsure what to do with it, because when the police felt like hurling a match at a glacier, and I knew that unless I could prove Caleb had existed, had suffered, had been, it would all be dismissed as hearsay, nostalgia warped by grief. So I went back to the cellar, this time with gloves and shovel and the determination of someone who had seen the consequence of silence, and I began to dig, not in the literal dirt at first, but in the records beneath the house. I pried open floorboards, traced pipes to hidden valves, uncovered a second panel of photographs sealed in a drawer, one of which showed Caleb with a birthday cake, alone, a single candle burning, his face partially obscured by a motion blur, and on the back, written in that same childish hand, were the words, "Please remember me this way." And I pressed that photo to my chest and cried, not just for him, but for everyone who played a part in forgetting him, myself included. And as the days passed, the weight of that truth changed me. I stopped looking people in the eye, not because I feared them, but because I could see now how much we were all hiding, how easily we dress wounds in smiles and pave over graves with sidewalks. And it occurred to me then that maybe Langridge had never been a town. It had been a cover story, a mask worn by hundreds, and the Langridge house was its heart, and that heart had never slept, never stopped beating with the rhythm of secrets told only in hush and horror. And I knew that exposing this story would come at cost. But I was no longer afraid of the price, because once you've seen the truth, the raw, pulsing core of it, you can't unsee it. And you shouldn't tee or wide. It was nearly a week after I'd uncovered the cellar when I found the letters, and I almost missed them, tucked inside a hollowed-out copy of Pilgrim's Progress on the top shelf of the Langridge study, where dust had settled thick and undisturbed, where time seemed to pause at the threshold like even it was reluctant to enter. The book fell open when I pulled it down, heavier than expected, and what spilled out on the floor weren't just pieces of paper. They were confessions, artifacts of a past too fragile to survive the sunlight, and I gathered them with a reverence I hadn't known I could feel for handwriting, holding each folded page like it might shatter between my fingers. And the first was from Thomas, dated July 1995, addressed not to anyone specifically but to the boy who won't come out of the shadows. And as I read, my throat tightened with every line, every hesitant sentence scratched in teenage uncertainty, because here was a brother, afraid, confused, deeply ashamed, trying to reach someone who had already begun to vanish before his eyes. And Thomas wrote of long nights listening to Caleb cry through the floorboards, of the guilt he felt pretending not to hear it, of the dreams he had where they ran away together, built a raft like Tom Sawyer, and escaped the house where love was given like currency and taken like punishment. And he ended the letter with a single question that broke me. "Do you still believe I'm your brother?" And there were no reply letters, not at first, just more pages from Thomas, scattered and unsent, hidden like shame beneath book bindings and dresser drawers. And then came one that changed everything, dated months later, written in A, smaller, slanted hand I didn't recognize until I saw the initials at the bottom, CL, and Caleb's voice hit me like a whisper from beneath the floorboards, tender, desperate, heartbreakingly composed. And he began with a thank you. Thank you for hearing me, even when you couldn't say anything back. And he spoke of long days in the cellar, not in rage or fear, but in aching loneliness, describing the way light trickled through a small vent like a distant dream, the way he counted dust particles to measure time, and how sometimes he imagined the sound of Thomas's footsteps above was a heartbeat meant just for him. And I could barely finish the letter without breaking, because in it, Caleb never once asked why. They never do, not children who've been made to believe suffering is their fault. But instead, he apologized for being too loud, too needy, too much, and he wrote that he was trying to be quieter, trying to disappear better. And it was in that moment I understood the depth of the damage, not just a physical confinement, but the way it had turned a child's self-perception into a mirror reflecting only unworthiness. And the next letters grew darker, more fragmented, notations scrawled in margins, thoughts that read like prayers or final draft of goodbye. And I found one last envelope, never opened, sealed with a trembling wax impression that had cracked over time. And inside was a final letter from Caleb to his mother. Never sent, never read, or perhaps read and discarded. And it was the quietest, most devastating piece of writing I've ever held, a letter not of accusation, but of pleading, where Caleb asked her what he'd done wrong, how he could fix it, how he might become the kind of child she could love publicly. And in its final lines he wrote, "If I leave, will that help? Will the house finally be quiet again?" And my hand shook so hard I nearly dropped it, because it was clear then that Caleb had understood his erasure as a kind of sacrifice, something that could often make the family whole again. And I wept for a boy who believed his absence might be a gift. And I knew in that moment that these letters had to be seen, had to be shared, not in some morbid expose, but in a reckoning. Because the story of Langridge wasn't just about secrets hidden beneath floorboards. It was about love withheld until it became a weapon, and how that weapon could be wielded in silence, generation after generation, until someone finally dared say, enough. And as I copied the letters word for word, preparing them for what I didn't yet know, a book, a report, an archive, I understood that this was no longer just about memory or justice, but restoration, giving Caleb his name back, his story back, the pages of his life returned to the world he had been locked away from. And as I sealed them gently in a manila envelope, I whispered his name aloud just once, as if calling him back in the dark. And for a moment, the house didn't feel quite so silent. I wasn't sure what brought me to the shed that morning, the one that sat crooked in the far northwest corner of the Langridge property, hidden behind a wall of dormant hedges and long-forgotten garden tools. But something about the way it leaned, as if exhausted from decades of being ignored, called to me like a quiet voice long drowned out by louder lies. And when I pried open a rusted latch, the hinges groaned in protest, the door swinging back to reveal a musty, dim interior choked with dust and the scent of wet wood. And though I expected nothing more than discarded rakes and a deflated wheelbarrow tire, what I found instead was a series of boxes stacked neatly along the back wall, each labeled in the same controlled, almost inhuman cursive I'd seen in the logs beneath the cellar, and it struck me immediately that someone had kept records, not just hidden Caleb away, but documented it with bureaucratic precision. And as I opened the first box, my fingers trembling, I found dozens of manila folders containing school documents, psychological evaluations, and private correspondences between the Langridge family and a series of professionals, none of whom had ever reported a thing. And at the top of the first folder was a name I hadn't expected, Dr. Alden Reeve, the school's counselor during my time there, a man I remembered only vaguely as tall, gray, and always slightly damp, like he exuded discomfort. And I sat back, stunned, because if he had known, and this paperwork made it clear that he had, then that meant the silence had reached farther than just one house, deeper than just one family. And as I dug further, I uncovered taped audio cassettes labeled with dates and initials, and though I didn't have a player on me, I knew immediately what they were. Therapy sessions, perhaps even interviews, and tucked beneath them was a journal bound in leather, cracked with age and marked on the spine with the word observations. And open it felt like tearing open a wound, because inside were entries in Mrs. Langridge's unmistakable hand, entries that dissected her children's behavior like specimens. Thomas's increasing fragility, Margaret's recurring hesitations, and Caleb's emotional hyperreactivity, noted again and again, always in cold, clinical terms, as if they weren't people but test subjects in a long, private experiment on control, obedience, and image management. And I closed the book with shaking hands, bowel rising in my throat, and stepped outside, desperate for air, for clarity, for anything that wasn't this suffocating swirl of complicit silence. And that's when I saw her, Nora Raskin, the gardener's widow, who lived just 2 houses down and had been tending to the Langridge front gardens well into her 70s, now sitting quietly in a folding chair beside her rose trellis, her cane resting against one knee, watching me with a look I couldn't quite name, part curiosity, part resignation. And before I could even introduce myself, she said, "I always knew someone would come back." And those words hit me harder than I expected, because they weren't said with malice, but with a kind of weary knowing only time could forge. And I approached slowly, unsure what to ask, unsure what she might give, but it didn't matter. She spoke before I could, telling me in that quiet, cracking voice that she had once been inside the shed too, that her husband Henry had worked for the Langridges for almost 20 years before falling ill, and that he'd told her things. Never all of it, never clearly, but enough to know that something had been deeply wrong in that house, especially with the boy who wasn't seen. And she said that once, during a late summer thunderstorm, Henry had been called in the middle of the night to quiet something down in the basement, and when he came home, he was pale and silent, his hands shaking, and he sat on the edge of the bed until morning, refusing to speak except to say, "I think we're not supposed to be part of this anymore." And within weeks, he quit, quietly, without confrontation, and had told her never to bring up the Langridges again. And she hadn't, not until now. And when I showed her the letters, the photographs, the logs, she looked through them with slow, shaking hands, tears forming at the corners of her eyes but never falling, and she said, "There were always whispers, dear, always little things out of place." And she spoke of how the mailman had once confided that he delivered packages marked medical supply to the estate weekly but never saw a nurse, how the grocery clerk had noticed strange bulk orders, baby food in large amounts, even when the children were grown, and how, every time someone asked, there was always an answer, always a polished excuse. And eventually, people just stopped asking because the Langridges made them feel small without ever raising their voices. And that was the truth of it. They didn't need threats or force. They had presence, prestige, and the practiced art of making others doubt themselves. And as Nora leaned back, closing her eyes, for a moment she whispered, "That boy, he used to leave little things in the garden, stones and patterns, like messages, maybe hoping someone would notice." And I felt something in my chest crack then, something that I'd been trying to hold firm, and I realized that what we call silence is never really silence. Not in a place like Langridge. It's just a symphony of ignored signals, of things we pretend not to see, because seeing means responsibility. And that day, sitting beside Nora in the thinning sunlight, I understood that Caleb had never been fully alone, only unheard, and that it was time to change that. The garden behind the Langridge house had once been a crown jewel of the estate, meticulously arranged in concentric rings of roses, boxwoods, and low-lipped fountains that gurgled serenely while the rest of the town admired its timeless beauty. But when I returned to it now, shovel in hand and heart pounding like a warning bell in my chest, all I saw was a graveyard of memory, of truth, of voices that had begged for help and never been heard. And I walked slowly between the withered hedges past the once pristine stone path, now cracked and choked by creeping vines, until I stood in the spot Nora had described, the place where she said her husband had once seen small, deliberate patterns of stones laid out like messages, forgotten hieroglyphs meant for eyes that never looked closely enough, and though the garden had overgrown in the years since, something in the soil still felt disturbed, unsettled, not by animals or decay, but by intention, and I began to dig, not quickly, not violently, but methodically, letting the rhythm of the shovel bite into the earth in time with the pulse of my ears. And with each scoop, I felt closer, not to a body. I knew now I wouldn't find one, but to something far heavier, something that could only be unearthed by acknowledgement. And as the hole deepened, the dirt gave way to fragments of things that shouldn't have been here. A frayed blanket corner, a broken ceramic rabbit, the kind found in children's room decor, and beneath that, a small wooden plaque, warped and water-stained, with the initial CL burned into its surface in clumsy, uneven letters. And I sank to my knees, breath gone, heart clutched in my throat like a scream I hadn't realized I'd been holding in for decades. And I touched the plaque as if it might vanish under my fingers. And for a long time I couldn't move, couldn't even think, because this wasn't just a marker. This was a memorial, built not with ceremony or closure, but with shame, hidden in the earth like a wound that had never healed. And I understood, finally, that Caleb hadn't just been forgotten. He had been buried twice, once in silence, and once here where the roses bloomed brightest, because the soil had been turned more often, fed more deeply, not by fertilizer, but by the marrow of memory itself. And that night I sat beside a disturbed patch of dirt long after the sun went down, until the moon cast the garden in silver and shadow, and I thought about how many summer afternoons I'd run past this exact spot, chasing butterflies or laughing at something Thomas had said, completely unaware that just feet beneath me lay the artifact of a boy who had only wanted to be seen, and I felt the shame rise in me like a tide, not just for my silence, but for the way I'd allowed myself to remember Langridge as golden, picturesque, innocent. Because innocence, I now knew, wasn't just ignorance, it was a choice, and too many of us had chosen it. And in the days that followed, I brought everything I had, the letters, the photographs, the recordings, even the garden plaque, to the county archivist, not with the hope that it would spark outrage, but simply because the truth needed to be placed somewhere other than inside me, and I started talking, not to reporters or police at first, but to people I'd grown up with, old classmates, former neighbors, teachers, and as I spoke, I saw in their eyes a flicker of memory, of recognition, of suppressed guilt resurfacing like weeds, through cracked stone, and though some denied, deflected, pretended they had no recollection, others, like Mrs. Thorne, my old history teacher, simply wept, saying she'd known something was wrong but hadn't had the language, the courage, or the power to intervene, and I realized that silence had many accomplices, fear, politeness, exhaustion, and I was done with all of them, and as word spread, the Langridge name began to shift in meaning, not destroyed, not undone, but reframed, no longer just the banner above Town Hall or the scholarship fund, but the reminder of what silence costs, and I returned to garden one final time, this time with Nora, who held my hand as we stood over the freshly smooth soil, and though she didn't speak, her grip told me everything, that we owed this boy, this buried truth, not just remembrance, but promise that silence would no longer be the safest sound in town. IT was almost an afterthought when I went back to my mother's belongings one final time, weeks after the garden, after the letters, after the town had begun to murmur the name Caleb Langridge in hesitant, broken syllables like a curse they didn't yet know how to lift, and I told myself I was just organizing, just closing chapters, but deep down I think I knew there was something else, something I hadn't yet faced, not in the town, not in the Langridges, but myself, and as I rifled the final box in her attic, tucked between her nursing certificates and faded church bulletins, I found a slim manila envelope marked only with the word develop, and my stomach turned over because the handwriting wasn't hers, it was mine, scrawled in childish impatience. And I remembered then, in a flash so visceral it knocked a breath from me, a disposable camera I'd carry around the summer before Caleb disappeared, a cheap plastic thing I begged for at the grocery store, snapping pictures of bicycles, squirrels, my own shoes, and the Langridges, always the Langridges, because they were the tallest house, the most polished lawn, the place where every child's I naturally drifted, and I remember standing on my swing set one evening as the sun dipped low, and seeing someone sitting in the second-story window of the Langridge home, just a silhouette, still, unmoving, and I remember lifting the camera and clicking the shutter without even thinking, not knowing why I did it, only that it felt important in a way I couldn't explain, and the memory came back now with such force I could almost hear the click again, feel the grainy plastic in my hands, and I opened the envelope with shaking fingers, heart pounding as I pulled out the photos one by one. And most were nothing, blurry backyard scenes and overexposed. Dog, my own hand, but the last three made my blood run cold. The first showed the Langridge house, its second-story window aglow with soft light. And though the image was grainy, I could see clearly now what I had understood then, a small figure pressed against a window glass, face obscured by light glare, but unmistakably a child, and not Thomas or Margaret, whose profiles I knew by heart, but smaller, slighter, and the second photo, taken moments later, was of the backyard, empty, pristine, except for the faintest outline near the fence, something crouched low or crawling, half concealed by shrubbery, and it was impossible to be sure, but my gut told me the truth before my brain could catch up. It was Caleb, not yet disappeared, not yet erased, existing in those seconds in between, and the third photo, though the darkest, was the one that undid me. It was the side gate to the Langridge backyard, the one always chained from the inside, and in that image the gate hung slightly, ajar, as if someone had slipped through in haste, and standing just outside was a figure, an adult, barely in frame, their face turned away, but unmistakably my mother, wearing the same nurse's uniform she always did in those days, her hand hovering uncertainly near the latch, and the realization hit me like a blow to the chest. She had seen him or known or tried to help. Something, and never told me, never told anyone, and I sank to the floor. Photos spread around me like scattered memories, and sobbed, not because she was a monster, but because she wasn't, because she had lived beside that truth, walked past it every day, and still chosen not to speak, and that knowledge devastated me more than if she had been cruel, because it made her real, fallible human, and I understood then that this wasn't a story of villains and victims, but of people, broken, afraid, conditioned by generations to prioritize appearances over humanity. And in that moment, I forgave her, not because she deserved it, but because I had to, because anger alone wouldn't restore Caleb's voice. And the next morning, I brought the photos to the local paper, not the big city outlet that had called twice already, eager for scandal, but the same weekly flyer that had once printed Langridge's bake sale schedules and school honor rolls. And I placed the images on the editor's desk with trembling hands and said, "Print them, all of them, and tell the truth." And he stared at them for a long time before nodding slowly, like someone who had waited a lifetime to stop pretending. And that week, for the first time in decades, the name Caleb Langridge appeared in bold type on the front page, not as a footnote, not as a tragedy, but as a truth that had survived everything designed to erase it, and the town, for all its resistance and polished denial, had no choice but to look, and though some still averted their eyes, enough didn't, and that was enough to begin again. I found Thomas Langridge in a halfway house on the outskirts of Marlowe County, a weather-worn brick building that reeked of detergent and old shame, and when the receptionist told me he was allowed visitors only on Tuesdays and Sundays, I lied and said I was his cousin, and either out of fatigue or sympathy, she waved me in with a clipboard and a nod, and as I walked down the narrow corridor lined with laminated inspirational quotes and peeling linoleum, I braced myself for what I didn't yet know how to ask. Because confronting Thomas wasn't about accusation. It was about understanding, about finally placing a human face on the absence that had haunted me since childhood. And when I entered the communal room, he was there by the window, thin and pale, eyes hollowed out in a way that went beyond substance use or insomnia. It was the look of someone who had been digging a grave inside themselves for years and never found a bottom. And when I said his name, he didn't flinch or turn slowly like in the movies. He just nodded, as though he'd been expecting me, and he gestured the plastic chair across from him. And when I sat, neither of us spoke for a long time, the silence between us pulsing with unspoken history, until he said, "You found it, didn't you?" And I nodded, my throat too tight for words, and he leaned back against the window frame, eyes drifting toward the parking lot, as if trying to stare past memory. And he said, "It should have been me." And I asked what he meant, and he turned to face me then, and his face broke, not with tears, not with anger, but with something quieter, more brutal. Regret carved so deep it had become identity. And he told me everything, not in a linear way, but like someone emptying drawers, random fragment of memory tumbling out between shaky breaths. How their father had decided early on that Thomas would be the heir, the obedient one, the visible child, while Caleb, too soft, too inquisitive, was relegated to the shadows. And how, as Thomas grew older, he realized the cost of that. Privilege wasn't love but participation, that every yes sir and perfectly tied tie was a brick in the wall that kept Caleb locked beneath their lives. And how he had once tried to help, had snuck down to the cellar with a key he'd stolen from their mother's sewing box, only to find Caleb sitting in the corner, arms wrapped around his knees, who looked up at him and said, "Don't," not in fear, but in resignation, and how that single word had destroyed him more than any scream could have, because it meant Caleb had already accepted his fate, and Thomas had done nothing, had backed away, replaced the key, and convinced himself he couldn't change anything. And when I asked why he never spoke out after leaving home, after the family imploded and the town began to forget, he laughed, a sound so hollow it felt borrowed, and said, "Because I didn't deserve to," and I told him that wasn't his choice to make, that silence had protected his parents but damned his brother, and he said, "No," over and over like a prayer or a punishment. And then he pulled something from his coat pocket, a photograph, weathered and folded in half, and handed it to me, and on the back, in Caleb's hand, were the words, "For Thomas, if you ever find your voice." And I couldn't hold back then. I wept openly, and he didn't comfort me, just watched. And I realized in that moment that guilt could be inherited just like property or trauma, passed down like a family name, and Thomas had spent his whole life trying not to spend it, not to spend the blood price of silence. and I told him he didn't need to confess to me. He needed to speak publicly, to acknowledge Caleb not just in memory but in history. And he looked at me, truly looked, and said, "Would it matter?" And I said, "Only if you wanted to." And I left him there, not absolved, not redeemed, but perhaps no longer invisible. And I understood then that justice wasn't always loud or clean or final. It was sometimes a single voice cracking, in a quiet room, saying a name that no one had said aloud in decades. The town didn't change overnight. No town ever does. But in the weeks following the article's publication, something subtle began to shift, like ice cracking on a frozen lake in spring. Quiet at first, but unstoppable once it started, and I watched as Langridge, the place I'd once remembered only in sepia-tone nostalgia, began to reckon with itself. The plaque outside the Langridge Cultural Center was removed and silence won. Tuesday morning, replaced not with ceremony, but with an empty brick wall. And people began speaking Caleb's name, not often, not loudly, but enough to make it real again. And in a town where silence had once been currency, that was revolutionary. And I spent my final days there in a kind of limbo, caught between who I had been as a child and who I had become in the process of digging up not just the past, but my own place in it. And every step I took through the streets felt heavier than it had before, not from burden, but from truth. And it was truth that led me back to the garden one last time, where the soil had been carefully raked and flowers planted not in rows but in a ring, like a wreath placed gently atop a grave, and in the center stood a small wooden sign, unofficial, unenders, but they're all the same, that read, "For Caleb, who was always here." And I wept when I saw it, not for the horror, not for the loss, but for the fact that someone, maybe Nora, maybe one of the many, who had once looked away, had chosen to see him again, to mark the place not as haunted, but as holy, a sacred site of remembrance. And as I stood there, hand resting on the wood, I thought about how the Langridge name had once dominated this town like a statue too large to walk around, casting shadows where there should have been light, and how now, piece by piece, we were dismantling it, not to destroy, but to rebuild, brick by honest brick. And I thought about Margaret, living quietly in her facility, who now received a weekly letter from me, updates, confessions, sometimes just silence in written form. And she always wrote back, never long, but always signed, "Still here." And I thought about Thomas, who had begun attending therapy sessions sponsored by the local community center, quietly funded by donations that came without names, and about the town librarian, who had started compiling an unofficial archive of erased stories, beginning with Caleb's. And I understood, finally, what legacy really meant. Not the buildings named after you or the pictures hanging in City Hall, but the lives you touch, the pain you leave behind, the truths you either carry or cast away. And Caleb's truth had nearly been lost, not by accident, but by design, by the careful architecture of silence passed down like an heirloom. But it had survived, because pain doesn't die, not truly. It grows roots, deep and wide, beneath the skin of places and people. And sometimes, if you're quiet enough, you can feel it pulsing beneath your feet like the memory of something buried that refuses to stay gone. And as I left Langridge for the last time, watching the town disappear in my rearview mirror, I didn't feel finished. Some stories don't end, they echo. But I felt honest. And in a world where so many people live and die without ever being known, that felt like enough. And I whispered his name once more, just to be sure, Caleb. And the wind that met me was warm, like breath, like the past. Exhaling.